Hello, Estimating One students. This is John Hannon. I gave this lecture today in the classroom and the video was corrupted. So I'm sitting at my desk and I'm going to go over this material once more. Today, you were to have read Chapter 4. There is a quiz on Chapter 4 until midnight Central Daylight Time. It opened at 12 in the morning. 10 questions, true, false, multiple choice. The quiz will only be on the text material. All of these quizzes will be from the text. What I'm going to do today is talk about my own version of Chapter 4. The author of the text is trying to define the process of creating an estimate, essentially, in Chapter 4. And if I had not been exposed to any of this, it's decent material, but it seems complicated to me. So I wanted to give you my version of the estimate. And I'm going to show some slides here. Some of the words that we talk about today, these will not be on quizzes, but it will be on the final exam, and I'll give you definitions, formal definitions of these words. But I do want to talk about a cost breakdown structure and a price breakdown structure in my version of how to estimate. And associated with the cost breakdown structure known as the CBS, there's also cost categories and cost sources. Probably another word that I want you to know for the final exam. I noticed the textbook uses the word scope quite a bit. And I noticed also it does not define scope in the glossary of terms at the back of the book. So scope is a huge word in the design and construction engineering industries. So when we use it, I need you to know, when I use it, I need you to know what it means. So a formal definition I'm getting from AACE International, and essentially this is what it means. It includes all that a builder is contractually committed to perform or deliver. Okay? So everything in the contract documents that is required of the builder, we call that the scope. Okay? The scope of the work. If you do less than the scope of the work, then you're not fulfilling your contract. You're in breach of contract. If you do more, right, in the contractual scope, then you're doing work for free. Okay. So essentially, what a cost breakdown structure is, it defines the scope. It's a list of things that define the scope. And it's very important that the scope gets communicated to different stakeholders involved in building a project. And a cost breakdown structure or a work breakdown structure, sometimes they're the same thing, is an excellent way to communicate the scope of the work without giving every person 200 sheets of drawings and 2,000 pages of technical specifications. Okay? And in essence, this is a little diagram of the estimating process. Okay? So a cost breakdown structure is just a list. It's a list of things. A list of things that have to be delivered. Typically, a list of things that has to that have to be built. This is part of my problem today, and I haven't resolved it with UJA. All right, so a cost breakdown structure is a list of scope, things that must be built, and therefore we have to estimate the cost. Okay. An example of a very simple example would be something like this. There's, let's say, the scope of the job is to excavate and build a slab. Okay. So here are a list of items that need to be performed, and I can call this a list of scope. All right. It could be just three things. It could be mobilization, excavation, it could be slab on grade, or I can break these down into more detailed items underneath the parents. Okay. So a slab on grade, I can form, pour, finish the surface, strip the forms. I could have added reinforcing steel or place welded wire mesh, something like that. So you can go to many levels of detail. Simple is the best. Um, so this is the beginning of a cost breakdown structure. I have a list of things, right, that need to be done, that need to be estimated. Here's the same list, but it's really not a true scope until I have a quantity and a unit of measure. So just having the list is not the complete scope. The complete scope is when I've quantified this list. Okay. So somehow I've done a quantity takeoff and I've determined there's this many cubic yards of topsoil. I have to respread this many cubic yards of topsoil after the building's in place, which means I probably need to add something on here, which would be export topsoil, unless I can leave it in a pile, and so forth. Here's some excavation, mass excavation, some embankment, excavation for some footings, some piers, and so forth. Right? So this is much better scope definition since I have a quantity and UM stands for unit of measure. LS is lump sum, CY cubic yards, square feet. You can have different types of units of measure. Any unit of measure you can have in the cost breakdown structure. But most every item in the CBS needs to have a quantity and a unit of measure. And what is good about the method that I'm going to show you here regarding putting an estimate together is that this cost breakdown structure can be used over and over throughout the life cycle of the project. So for instance, you can use this same breakdown structure in a schedule. Okay. Sometimes when we put it in a schedule, we call it a work breakdown structure because typically all of the items in the schedule are activities. I'm not trying to teach you scheduling here, although chapter 4, the author talks about reasons that the estimator should schedule the project. And if you get involved with this business, you'll find out that estimates and schedules are very closely linked. They're not very distant cousins. Okay. So I can use this same CBS, I can take it over to a scheduling program like Microsoft Project, and here is the same breakdown right here. Okay. So here's my quantities, here's the unit of measure. And now all I need to do is really put logic, give the schedule some logic, and I'm on my way to a schedule. So this is called putting in schedule logic. Okay. And I don't want to get too far into it, but I want you to see here's the first instance uh, where you can use the cost breakdown structure for something other than the estimate. Let's see. So I don't want to get too far into that, but hopefully you get the idea. Now, this is defaulted to when I cut and pasted this CBS into this thing, it defaulted everything at 1 day. So we may come back to that. I've got a quantity here, but how do we figure out the duration of these activities if we wanted to schedule? All right. So the next step, the next thing we do with the cost breakdown structure after it's quantified is we apply cost to the CBS. So my list of scope that's quantified, I have to apply a cost. This stands for unit cost, and this stands for the extended cost. And the way you get the total is you take the unit cost times the quantity, gives you the total. Okay. So unit cost times the unit quantity gives you the total. All right. And that's really the basics of putting an estimate together. What we're going to concentrate in this course on for a while is just this quantification, and towards the end of the course we will put a small full estimate together. But the quantification right now is what takes up the majority of the time when putting estimates together. All right, so we have a list of scope, we quantified it with a quantity, a number, and a unit of measure, and now we want to apply cost. And the options for that are only three. There's three types of costs that you can apply to that CBS. One is a quote. I've talked about quote in here, I believe, already, but that is a price that you receive from a vendor, supplier, or a subcontractor. So I can send them, if I wanted to subcontract out the excavation in my estimate, I would take these cost items and their quantities, send them to Dan's dozer service, and ask him to give me a unit cost for each one of these. When he gives me the quote, I can plug it into my cost breakdown structure. So that's one way to apply cost, is have a subcontractor give you a quotation, or if I'm going to do the work myself, we do what's called a cost detail. And that's where we figure out what resources need to be expended to complete a cost item. So the resources to complete an excavation item would be heavy equipment like dozers, scrapers, maybe excavators. All right, so and I need people to operate those machines, and I add up all that cost, figure out how long it's going to take to complete 23,670 cubic yards, and a cost detail is deriving the cost myself. I'll show you an example of that better in a minute and probably later in the course. And then there's also a way you can just plug a cost. So there are databases that you can purchase, cost information that you can purchase, such as RS means, and you can look up You can look up excavation items in these proprietary for purchase cost books and apply an RS means number in here. That's just a plug. I'm plugging it. Okay. If I know a superintendent that's been doing that work for 2 or 3 decades, that veteran of the industry can probably tell you its cost out of his head, and you can just take a number from someone's head and apply it to a cost item in the cost breakdown structure. Okay. So I'm coming back to this. So we're going to do takeoff, quantity takeoff, or quantity surveying in worksheets first, in spreadsheets. And we're just going to look at one cost item at a time for several exercises. So you can do takeoff in a worksheet. It'll make sense after we do a few of them. And this information can feed to the list of scope or the cost breakdown structure. Okay. And then some of this data will go over to the price breakdown structure, and then we'll have a proposal based upon our price. So we'll start out with worksheets. There's also specific software applications that do quantity takeoff, and we'll try out one of those. On-screen takeoff, Bluebeam, we'll get a little bit of experience using one of those to get our quantities for the CBS. So there's worksheets, specific applications, and then of course, as I said, the cost breakdown structure can be used in a schedule, or you can use it to solicit quotations from subcontractors and material suppliers. And then one thing to keep in mind is that this portion of the whole schema here is estimate. This is estimating. It's on the cost side. Okay. And this is really what we're most concerned about in this class. Once we create a price breakdown structure, then we're dealing with price. So price and cost are very separate. Estimates and bids are very separate. Okay. So if you're an estimator, you'll be doing this work, not necessarily this work. Typically, it's bid by executives in the firm, in the building organization, that type of thing. If you're an experienced enough estimator, you may end up doing both sides of the equation. Okay. So the thing that delineates, that morphs the cost breakdown structure into a price breakdown structure are markups. Okay. And markups refer to definitely profit and overheads. So we discussed in class today the difference between direct cost and overhead. And I'll give you definitions of those as well. There are two types of overheads. One's called project overhead or job overhead. The other is called business overhead or home office overhead. So here I kind of have a metaphor in the form of a pyramid. And if all of this represents the total price of a bid, okay, this is the elements of the price breakdown structure, then I have basically 4 elements. I have direct cost. This comes from the CBS. direct cost. Then two types of indirect costs, right? So everything is a cost until you get to profit, because overhead costs real dollars. This overhead is pertains to the project specifically. Typically, it's the salaried personnel and all of the office supplies and facilities that are required to complete the direct cost items. Direct cost items typically are installed in the facility, all right? So when the builder leaves, those direct cost items are still there. And job overhead, that's not true. So the job trailer and the porta-johns and the staging area and all of those things are a part of job overhead. They do not stay with the facility when it's completed. And the same can be said for business overhead. This is every project has to help pay to run the business. So typically the executives in the company, their salaries have to be included in the price that we offer owners, so we can pay salaries that are not directly related to the project. So the CFO and the CEO and the president of the company and all the support staff at the main office and all the costs to run the office is business or home office overhead. A portion of those costs have to be carried by every estimate. And then don't worry about these two markups. Just marking up all of these costs is profit. Okay. So let me give you an example of a comparison between the cost breakdown structure and the price breakdown structure. So here we are. This is a spreadsheet example. These are cost items. It could be a list of materials. If you want to start out thinking in those terms, list all your materials there. You're starting to build a cost breakdown structure. Once you apply labor and equipment costs, those items become activities, but that's a different discussion. So anyway, these could be the items that I was just showing, the excavation items, the slab on grade items, okay? So notice they're quantified with a unit of measure, and here this U stands for unit cost, okay? So this is a CBS of just unit costs. And just like the textbook talks about these categories, these are called cost categories. So here I have labor cost category. This is the material cost category. I think the author just talks about labor, material, equipment, and subcontractors. And that's fine. That's the most simplest categorization of cost. In this example, I've taken the direct labor and all the labor, insurance, taxes, and fringes called labor burden, and I've separated those into two categories. Same with material and tax. I like to see the tax broken out. Some folks don't do it that way. I have different categories for equipment, owned and rented. Here's one for subcontractor. You could have any number of cost categories. Don't want to get too complicated with it. Okay, so here are my cost items with the quantities, and these are the total units. I wouldn't know what the total extended cost is, right, unless I multiplied the total unit cost times the quantity. Unit cost times the unit quantity. That would give me the extension. Okay. So if I did that, 40 times this is the extended amount. So this is a cost breakdown structure. These are the cost categories. And remember, this is the direct cost. And here is a price breakdown structure. Notice it mirrors closely the breakdown here They don't have to exactly be the same, but they can be. And these are the elements, okay, of the price breakdown structure. We've got the direct cost, got the direct cost. We've got the job overhead element, the home office or business overhead, right here, and here's my profit. Now this table has unit and extensions. So there's my 31, 37, same as over here. Don't need that anymore. So notice this unit cost from the CBS shows up right over here. So I don't know if I can draw a little arrow on here or not. Maybe so. Okay, so you'll see you'll see these numbers come over here, and we add the overheads. We let each item in the price breakdown structure carry a percentage of these overheads. And then we mark it up for profit, and whatever this ends up being in the end, that's your price. Okay. So in this simple scenario, there's my price, my bid, and this is my version of text chapter 4. Okay. And it just seems simpler than the way he laid it out, right? So we create a cost breakdown structure, we quantify it, we apply at least one cost source to each cost item, we allocate overhead costs, we allocate profit, submit the proposal, so forth and so on, estimating, bidding, blah, blah. Okay. I talked about the 3 types of cost sources, right? I can solicit quotations and receive them and put them into my cost breakdown structure. I can plug costs from databases or experts' brains, or I can derive the cost myself with what we call a cost detail. And I don't want to go too far into that, but just to give you an idea, here's a separate example. Let's say I'm trying to figure out the cost of an excavation item. So there's 50,000 cubic yards of excavation in this example. Well, I've got material resources that I need to use. I've got labor resources that I need to use, equipment resources. I might have some subcontracting, but if I'm self-performing this, then I need people, common laborers, equipment operators, a mason, truck driver. I need this number of those resources. I need 5 common laborers. I need 3 truck drivers. I need them for this duration, right? I'm saying I need them for 5 days, and the days are 10 hours. So this is the man hours or the person hours. And these are their direct labor wages, and all the labor with maybe without burden. I don't know if it's burdened or not. But there's the labor cost, right? Here's the material cost. Got to be sure it has tax. And then the equipment, we charge ourselves per the hour, just like people on equipment. And this is the equipment cost. So if I add all of these costs together, that's the cost of this excavation cost item. If I divide it by 50,000, then that's the unit cost. Right? So a good estimator is one that can identify what types of labor, what types of equipment, that they can figure out what crews need to be applied to a cost item, and they can figure out how many days are required to completely put into, in this case, excavate 50,000 cubic yards. Okay? And that's called cost detailing. Right? Like I said, I don't want to go too far into it. And then your cost breakdown structure can have any combination of cost sources. So some may be plugs, some may be cost details. That's what derived means. You take some quotes and award the quotes. So you'll have a combination of cost sources here. And again, cost categories, cost items in the CBS. And finally, the way that you would cost detail an item, that's kind of the same skill as figuring out the durations of these schedule items. So if I knew what the production rate of my crew was to complete this 23,675 cubic yards in stripping topsoil, if I knew how many I could complete in a day, then I would know how many days I needed. So if I have 23,6, what was it? 675. Maybe I can do, just keep it simple, 1,000 yards per day. Okay. This is my quantity. This is my production rate. Quantity per day. And if I divide this, the quantities cancel out, and I just get days. So equals my total quantity. Whoops. Equals my quantity divided by what I can complete per day. All right, so there's 23 and a half days. I'll call it 24 on here. And this is how you estimate and schedule, basically. All right. All right. So the cost breakdown structure can become my work breakdown structure in a schedule. Okay. So it's a pretty important thing, this CBS. Right? And that's the main thing I want you to think about now is really just this cost breakdown structure. And we'll do some single cost item takeoffs for a while. We'll do it with worksheets in the class. Then we'll graduate to a specific quantity takeoff software application, which automates it, makes it simpler, quicker. And then towards the end of the class, we'll create a cost breakdown structure. We'll mark it up, make it a PBS, and we'll get to see how all this works together. So I hope that wasn't too long or too complicated. I think it's simpler than the way that the author of the text broke it out. All right. So again, these won't be on your quiz, but I'll give you definitions of these things. This material will be on the final exam. So thank you very much. I'll hope this was helpful.